so excited to have Kate Balestrieri on today to talk about all things sex related. I feel like you are the go-to for sex therapy.
Well, that's an honor. It's an honor to be here, and also like what a recommendation. Thank you for that.
Well, I would love for anyone that doesn't know who you are, for you just to give yourself a little brief intro so people can get to know you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So I'm Dr. Kate Balestrieri. I'm a licensed psychologist, a certified sex therapist, certified sex addiction therapist, and then a PACT trained couples therapist. And I own a therapy practice nationwide called Modern Intimacy and have a podcast called Get Naked with Dr. Kate. So I've been talking about sex and relationships and mental health for almost 20 years now in this work. It's been quite a journey.
This is so fascinating. I'm just like dying to know, how did you get
Yeah.
into like the sex therapy part?
Yeah, it was a really circuitous path. Honestly, if we had been talking 20 years ago, I probably would have laughed in your face if you said you would be a sex therapist in Beverly Hills, because I was on a really different path. I started in this space of mental health as a forensic psychologist, and I did a lot of evaluations and treatment with sexually violent persons in prison settings for years. I also worked
Wow.
with non-sexually violent offenders and did a lot of more just forensic work. So helping judges understand degrees of risk with different offending patterns and helping to inform their decision-making process about people being ready for parole, people being too dangerous to be back in the community, and really helping those folks remediate their dangerous behaviors. So I did that for many years, and after a while, I really just kind of got tired of working in prisons and being in prisons and recognizing all of the politics and the bureaucracy that actually made it really difficult for people to get the help that they needed. So I
Mm,
decided to transition into private practice more and help people with a little bit more access to the kind of treatment modalities that would be actually useful for them. So I started, taking all of that knowledge that I had about sexual offending behavior and looking at, well, what are the deficits that people have about sex in general? What are the deficits they have in education? And so I started
Mm.
getting more training around that. And that was just a really easy parlay into working with folks who were not exhibiting offending behavior, but also had some sort of pain and some sort of frustration in their sex lives. So from there, I really just kind of moved to working with survivors, working with people who were struggling to have the kind of sex that they wanted to have or have a relationship with sex that felt really empowered for them. And here we are many years later.
That's an incredible story. I bet that would have been heavy working in the prison system. I can't imagine.
At times it
mm,
was. At times it was. But I will say one of the things that it really did for me was help me understand that the people who commit these really egregious crimes are also human beings. And I think it's really
Mhm.
easy in our society to paint them as monsters who need to be vilified and locked away forever and ever. But that approach does not actually address the cultural problem of sexual violence. It just makes it easier for people to look away from, actually, because when you think that it's just those people, those bad people who do the bad
Mhm.
things,
Mhm.
you ignore the reality that it is your family members, it is your neighbors, it is your coaches, it is the people around you doing the things that are labeled so egregious. So it really helped me develop a better understanding of sort of the pervasiveness of rape culture and the myths around safety and how to be better at being preventive around sexual violence.
Holy cow. My mind is like
Me too.
running in
Like
10 million different directions because there's so much to play off of that. But I think if we start with Laura, and you had a bunch of great questions here. If we start with like our relationship with sex from like the teenage
yeah,
years,
from
and where do we like how we learn about sex, if that's through religion, if that's through parents, if that's through sex education at school, which I know has changed dramatically since we have all been in school. But super fascinating. I guess, Laura, what was your first
well,
question about teen?
it seems that kids are having sex so much younger now, and I wanted to know from you, what is there a age that you think is appropriate to have sex? Because I remember my therapist
Mm,
saying, one of the issues is that when you're really young, you're not emotionally equipped to deal with sex.
yeah.
You're not mature enough. And so I wanted to know, do you think that there is an age that's appropriate to have sex, but
Mm.
also we can we can circle back and I can ask the next question. We can
Well, I would say there's not a definitive age that makes sense for everyone. So much of what is complicated for people when they are first becoming sexual is the fact that they don't have age appropriate understanding of their bodies and of consent and of pleasure. So, a lot of kids who are experimenting with sex are doing so without really understanding what it is. They just know something feels good in my body and I'm okay
Mhm,
with that. But when we look at things like who are they being sexual with, that changes the conversation. If there are
right.
age appropriate peers that they're experimenting with, that may or may not be a more appropriate conversation to be having or a more appropriate experience for them to have. But the majority of kids who are having sex who are younger, I shouldn't say the majority. Many kids who are having sex younger are being exploited by either older children with age gaps that make it very inappropriate and create a power imbalance that really negates their consent, or adults who are grooming them and
Mhm,
being exploitative in the same ways. So I think we have to look at the context of how is the sex occurring in their
mhm,
world, and also how are the people around them reacting to it. So what education have they had? How are the people reacting to it? What are the consequences of it? And what are the power imbalances that they are experiencing in this context? And I think that would help us understand what is a more appropriate age for them to be sexual. Um, so probably it's inevitable that more kids will start exploring their bodies with intention around sexual pleasure as they approach puberty and
mhm.
and begin to sort of develop in their teen years. But we are seeing more and more exposure to pornography at younger ages and sexual activity at younger ages. But there's a lot of question about the intentionality of that. And that brings us back to the context, right? Is it age appropriate
Right.
exploration or are they being exploited or are they vulnerable in some way?
So where do you think is best to get your education on sex? How is it how do you share the information with the child so that
Mm.
there are these healthy emotions and understanding around sex?
Yeah, I think parents have a really complicated job around this task because it is kind of big. And parents are the gateway to children's understanding about sexuality. And they communicate to them things about sex based on what they do say and how they do educate them, and also what they don't say or how they don't educate them, right? So
Mhm,
parents do have a really important role in understanding the information that their children are first exposed to. So, if I
mhm,
were designing the curriculum for the whole
mhm,
world, what it would look like is parents having a lot better sex education that is age appropriate and actually starts the conversation about bodies and touch and consent much earlier in children's lives because those are the foundational conversations that later help children understand the importance around sexuality and a yes and a no and consent and boundaries and communication. when we get them
Mhm.
learning young about things as seemingly innocuous as encouraging our children to hold a boundary if one of our family members wants to give them a hug, for example, and they don't want to hug. A lot of parents sort of fall into this role in their family of like, just give Uncle so and so or Aunt so and so a hug.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just go give them a hug. And they're well meaning because they want
Mhm.
to have that relationship flourish. But what they're inadvertently teaching their children is your boundaries don't matter and your body belongs to someone else's interests. And so I think just having those earlier conversations with kids about their bodies and um, is it okay if I help you go to the bathroom? Is it okay if I um, do the wiping? You know, like helping kids negotiate that consent early and really respecting their boundaries gives them an implicit understanding of the importance of asking people to be in
Mm.
contact with their bodies and also having their yes or their no solicited and respected.
I would have never even thought of that, and that makes so much sense.
Mhm.
Mhm.
You do need to be writing the curriculum for all of us
Yes.
parents. I'm like, because how do
Yes.
you
Yeah.
Okay, so early consent and understanding of that, and then from that, when once they're getting older, where do you take it from there?
Yeah, I would again sort of come back to parents and I would ask parents to think about how comfortable are you in thinking about sex and talking about sex. And if the answer is you're very uncomfortable, I might say, okay, that's fair. A lot of people were never taught how to talk about sex or how to think
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
sex.
Yeah.
So what can you do to get yourself more comfortable? Because your kids are going to have questions. And if you model that it's safe to talk about things and they can talk about it with you, they're more likely to talk about it with you than they are to go to porn or websites or their peers to get information that you may not want them knowing right now or that
Mhm.
may be beyond their cognitive sophistication to understand. So really like parents have this great opportunity to not only kind of heal their own relationship with sex, but be a
Mhm.
model for their kids that it's okay to talk about these things because your kids will have questions. And if you model that they can come to you without negative consequences, without shame, then you're probably going to be a person closer to the first person, if not the first person that they go to with these questions.
So this is I'm gonna tread lightly here because I wanna be I respect this topic and I wanna be respectful.
Mhm.
But Laura and I both grew up in very Christian homes where you didn't have sex. The intent was you didn't have sex until you were married.
Right.
And
And it was
with that,
taboo.
Hmm.
yeah, so there wasn't a lot of talk about sex around it, which I'm sure has changed since, lots of things have evolved. But in a Christian or in any kind of religious culture where it's really not acceptable, there's a lot of women that grow up and get into these first sexual relationships once they're married, and they're like feeling all of this shame, like it feels dirty, it feels wrong,
Yeah.
even though they know that they did it the right way. Like, what is your experience with that?
Yeah, it's really common for people who grow up in high control religion environments or high control cultural environments around sex where there was a lot of sex negativity and shaming to, just as you say, sort of follow that path and quote unquote do it right according to the
Mhm.
scripts they've been given. And they do struggle with really being able to surrender to pleasure and be expressive in their sexuality with their partner. Because that shame has been so embedded. And this is one of the risks of taking an abstinence only model to sex education. It actually does not equip people to make better decisions, first of all. Um,
Mhm.
and when I say better decisions, I mean decisions that might actually align with the scripts that they've been given based on cultural or religious mandates. Um,
Mhm.
they end up often sort of internalizing this experience of shame so that sex is then something uncomfortable for the rest of their lives, potentially. Or
Mhm.
they kind of rail against it and they rebel against it and they want what is the taboo. And so they dive headfirst into what they're quote unquote not supposed to do based on these scripts. So
Mhm.
from my perspective, I think it is important to honor whatever cultural and religious beliefs are important to you, but also to provide secular sex education about bodies and consents and pleasure so that people do understand that there is an importance to knowing that and then they can make the decisions that align with their faith. And that's a more
Mhm.
powerful yes, right? If I'm really choosing to do this when I have this information, that's a strong
Yes.
confirmation of faith in my perspective. But a
It's
lot of
so true.
yeah, a lot of people are really nervous that their children will not follow the tenets of their faith, and I get that. And also, it's been proven time and time again that not having the conversations with your kids sets them up for more difficulties with sex and more difficulties with adherence to your faith moving forward, right? When we're
Mhm.
really restricted, people tend to rail against that.
So true.
That is it right there, and I think what I
Mhm.
mean, like, we're complete journalists on this, like, I'm just, facilitating the conversation, because, we all have people on both sides
Mhm,
of this that would live in our lives, but what is your initial thought, religion aside,
mhm,
of, marrying someone or being in a long like, I guess marriage and or moving in because you could just move out, but marriage is a little bit harder to just kind of dissolve
mhm.
with not having any sexual experience, and then if you get with someone that, like, doesn't really have the same sexual interests, and you're like, "Well, now what do I do?"
Yeah, what do you think about not having sex before you get married?
I'm a really practical person, and I think that sexual compatibility is something that can be worked through if there are incompatibilities. There are many couples who love each other and care about each other and can find a middle ground if they have a lot of mismatched sexual interests or libido. But I think that their ability to find that middle ground rests on a tremendous amount of compatibility, care, and mutuality in other parts of the relationship. So it's not always a given.
Mhm.
So, because I'm so pragmatic and practical, I would not advise people to marry someone without being sexual with them. But that also is in line, that is in alignment with my beliefs around spirituality and religion as well. And for a lot of people, it's
Mhm.
not. So I think it's a
Yeah.
gamble if you're going to do
Mhm.
that. And I think you have to really ask yourself, is the marriage what does marriage mean to me and how important is a compatible sex life in that marriage, because for some folks it's not their biggest priority and so they might not be very disappointed when their sex life is incompatible if it is, but for other people they've been waiting for their partner and they've been waiting for marriage and they've been waiting for this experience where they can open up sexually and have this sort of transcendent connection through sex with their partner. And when that doesn't happen, they're devastated. And
Yeah.
it can feel
Yeah.
very traumatic to one or both partners in those scenarios and something that then can become a wedge in their relationship if they're not able to find some path forward together collaboratively.
Well, this is like staying on this topic, whether what we've just discussed is the reason or you're just 20 years into a marriage and you're having other issues and you have work stress and life stress and kid stress and, you know, lots of things that we weren't planning on that life throws at you. And you're not finding this because not all the time, but what we hear about more are the stories of, the men being like, my wife just doesn't wanna have sex, and this could be I only work with women, over pretty much the age 35, 40. Our podcast is pretty much women over 35, kind of that 40 age range. So, it's, these there could be multiple layers of why that is, but, like, well, perimenopause, menopause is a reason why somebody might not like it or want it or crave it, desire it more, but then there's also, maybe that sexual incompatibility comes from a lack of intimacy?
Yeah, it can. It can come from a lack of emotional intimacy. When I work with folks around this same age group who are making these sorts of complaints about their sex life, the themes are often things like perimenopause, like you mentioned, in menopause, um, being exhausted with disparities in domestic labor at home and feeling
Mhm.
like they don't have time to actually be their own human self because they're so
Mhm.
focused on running the household and taking care of everybody in it. And they have very little time for self care and to be in their bodies. Um, Sexual entitlement from their partner. And there's a lot of really interesting research that will be shocking to no one who's on one side of the equation and very shocking to the people on the other side of the equation. But sexual entitlement actually evokes an inverse relationship with desire, meaning the more sexual entitlement someone perceives from their partner, the lower their desire is going to be.
Yes. I don't know why that would be shocking for
I
anyone, but
know.
it's probably shocking for a lot of men.
Yes.
For the people who are
Uh,
more entitled, right? Because they're like,
uh,
yeah, this is great. I want it. You should want it too.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
your partner's over there like, "Ugh, again. So any sort
Yeah.
of like obligatory sense around sex is going to be a libido killer for
Yeah.
sure.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
Yeah.
and I think one thing that a lot of folks really sleep on when it comes to recognizing what's going on in their sex life is feeling like you are a part or a parent and not a partner with your partner, right? So like
Mm.
feeling like you are emotionally taking care of them, they're another kid that you have to manage. Like all of
Yeah.
that creates a different dynamic that makes it very difficult for people to want to be sexual with that partner. So, really
Mhm.
restoring parity in emotional labor is important in a relationship.
I
Such a good point.
I'm
Do you
dying.
do you feel like when you are in a relationship, a marriage, and there is I feel like talking to my friends and peers, oftentimes it's the woman or the man who wants to have sex more than the other, or they go through, periods of when the man wants it more or the woman is. And it's interesting to have the conversations of the push and pull, that emotional push and pull. What's your advice to people in relationships when, one of the partners does want to have sex more than the other? And it isn't just like what we were talking about.
Yeah. Well, I would say that it's totally to be expected, right? Like you are two separate human beings. So the likelihood that you're going to be wanting the same things at the same time to the same degree is pretty unlikely, right? Whether we're talking about how hungry you are, how thirsty you are, how tired you are, or how much sex you want to have, right? Like you are two different individuals and you're going to have some mismatches that are to be expected and inevitable in terms of your libido and maybe even the kind of sex you want. It's really
Mm.
common for people to have these, I would say, different points of exploration into their identities, but also into their lives. And that can happen at different times in people's marriages. One partner might have a promotion at work or achieve a milestone and be like, wow, I'm really like excited about life. And that might open up for them this curiosity about what else in life they can experience. And the other partner may feel kind of stagnant in their life for some reason and not able to kind of go on that expansive journey with their partner in that time frame. So I think it's really, to be expected that we're going to do a little bit of back and forth with pacing. So having grace with each other, talking about that, being really open about, what are your capacities and what aren't your capacities can be a helpful point of resolution for folks. Delegating when you can, hiring other people, outsourcing things so that you can, if you can afford that, or you have the
Mhm.
support around you to do that, can be a great way to kind of get your pacing to be a little bit more even or aligned. But it really takes a lot of teamwork because there's a lot going on in your individual lives
Yeah.
and in your family life, and that all requires your attention.
So that's where like scheduled sex would come into play.
Hmm. Yeah, and I would never say to schedule sex in a way that makes it an obligation for either partner, but
Mhm.
Mhm.
definitely schedule time to create moments of intimacy, whether it leads to
Yeah.
sex or not. Okay, but definitely schedule time to be together with the possibility of sex being on the table. But I have heard a lot of partners weaponize that and say, well, sex therapists say we should schedule sex, so therefore we should do it. And I just want to reiterate, this should never be used coercively.
So
Yeah.
what about like when we talk about intimacy, and we've had a marriage and family, therapy couple on our podcast a couple of times, and we've talked to them about this. But Laura, I don't know how you are, but for me, intimacy up until like my I don't know, 20s, maybe even early 30s, I just like I just put that with sex only. Like intimacy was sex. And there wasn't this emotional intimacy and other ways of having intimacy outside of like, well, that just means sex. Or for the man, it just means intimacy is sex. So
Mm,
what about the emotional intimacy, and what is that? What does it look like you know, in a relationship?
yeah. I mean, intimacy is really about seeing your partner in their holistic state and being willing to be seen in your holistic state. So, like being willing to be witnessed, witnessing your partner, really knowing them. That kind of emotional intimacy is really important to feel safe with partners, safe enough with partners. And it can really enhance the sexual exploration and the trust that you have in creating sexual experiences together when you have more emotional depth and connection. But really, that intimacy is about like being known, right? And knowing another person. So we can have intimacy with romantic partners, sexual partners, platonic people in our lives, even coworkers we have intimacy with. It's just different kinds of intimacy. It can be intellectual intimacy, it can be spiritual intimacy, emotional, romantic, sexual. Like there's lots of ways to be
Mm,
intimate.
that's great.
When you're intimate with your spouse or someone that you're in a relationship with, and you feel like the intimacy is there, you're in a healthy relationship, but you've been together for a really long time and you just want to spice things up or you want to enrich your sex life that you have with your partner, do you find exploring with different things, whether it be like sex toys or I really want to know what you think about like taking ecstasy or sex gummies, something like pretty minor, just to like loosen,
Spice it up.
yeah, spice it up, or almost like, yeah, go to a different place with your partner.
Mhm.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think that as long as there are two consenting parties, just about anything goes. And the more creative you allow yourselves to be, the more opportunities you'll have to figure out what creates pleasure for both partners or all partners if you invite more people into the mix, even. But in terms of MDMA and ecstasy and other substances, I think well, first of all, they're illegal, so I can't technically recommend that.
That's right. Sorry about
That's
Go to
okay.
Mexico.
But what I would say is that if you found a way to do it legally somewhere in the world, there are legal places to do those substances. Or if you're going to do them underground. One thing to know is that they can actually create a lot of openness and connection, but they can also create different impediments to sexual intimacy. So, for example, with MDMA and ecstasy, many people with penises have a hard time having an erection during
Mhm.
use because of the way it changes circulation and blood flow in the body. So a lot of folks will find themselves really disappointed or really frustrated if that happens to them and their goal was to be sexual. So I would say if you're going to do that, and again, I'm not recommending it because it is illegal still in the States, but if you're going to do that, talk to your doctor about whether or not you can take other medications like Viagra or Cialis to, try to offset that, but be truthful with what you're doing so that you can get the medical advice that makes sense for you. Again, I'm not recommending it because it's illegal.
Yes.
And
No one's getting sued here.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna put my low level intelligence on this on this part of the conversation to say, is MDMA and ecstasy not the same thing?
I think that's a good question. Different people have different answers for you on that, but they generally are thought of as the same thing or having the same function. But there might have
Okay.
historically different compounds created, but I think we can sort of conceptualize them as one and the same.
Okay. I had no
Yeah.
clue. And I'm sure I was like, other people, if I don't know, other people clearly don't know.
That's
So,
true.
I'm not.
Well, and even even if it's not like as extreme as, what we're talking about, but even just a glass of wine, I feel like anything to kind of loosen you up, or sometimes I find like people get a little bit more frisky and open and kind of
yeah.
verbalizing what they want.
Yeah,
There's it creates more of an openness. I just wondered if you thought that was a positive experience in relationships.
I think it can be. I think it also comes like sex gummies, for example. That have THC in them or have other ingredients that allege to increase arousal, they can be great, and they can, and alcohol too, they can offer those sort of opening experiences where you're a little less inhibited. So, from that perspective, it might open up a whole world of opportunity, but they also can dull senses.
Mm,
Alcohol can dull your sensory input, THC can dull it at times. So, it's sometimes a trade off in terms of
yeah.
like what is right for each partner and each couple.
Mm.
I want to go back to what you said when you first answered the question, when you said inviting other people in.
Mhm.
So, can you sh- say more about that
Elaborate.
topic? Yeah. Can you elaborate, please?
Yeah, I mean, look, more and more people are looking at eh, redefining their monogamy
Hmm.
to include other people from time to time. And I think, or even just opening their relationship altogether. So there are a lot of different experiences that you can look to if you are, really trying to create a different dynamic in your partnership. But for a lot of folks, it might be helpful to sort of think about expanding your monogamy to be more monogamish, right? And what I mean by that is
I like it.
that's not my term, um,
Yeah.
I
but
was gonna say, you just invented a
I
new
know. I
term.
was like, you got to coin that.
no, no, not my term. I don't remember who invented it, but it's not mine. But a monogamish dynamic essentially means that when you invite other people into your experience, you're being sexual together with that other person. So inviting them in is to enhance the sexuality that you share together, right?
Mhm.
Versus other open relationship dynamics, you may or may not be playing together with another person, but often there is the expectation that you're going to have experiences without one another, right? So that's where maybe the monogamy piece is a little bit harder to hold on to. But a
Mhm.
monogamish dynamic can introduce a lot of novelty. It can give you a lot of fun to play with. It can evoke a lot of emotions that can be really destructive in a partnership if you don't know how to process them together. But it can also be really healing and connecting to feel a little bit of envy, a little bit of jealousy, or a little bit of fear. Like jealousy is not the bad guy, I will say. Jealousy gets a bad rap, but jealousy is not a terrible emotion if it is processed in a healthy way between partners.
Okay, where my mind went was the show of Robert Redford and Demi Moore.
Yeah,
She like,
Oh,
was that
what
a
is
decent
that?
proposal?
Indecent Proposal, where I'm
yeah.
like, the jealousy like came out. Obviously, that was a different situation, but I mean, that was the whole time I was just like, well, what about the partner that gets jealous? And I guess it comes down to individual partnerships,
Mhm.
each individual circumstance, and whether they're, what is their level of maybe control or
Mhm.
jealousy that your partner has. Because I mean, I can think of a few, relationships where I'm like, "Oh, their partner would not be down
Yeah.
with the open marriage," but maybe that's why not everyone adds the monogamish term to theirs.
Exactly, like, monogamy is not a bad thing. If that's what makes both partners feel safe and it's exciting for them, that's amazing, that's great. Like, monogamy can be really wonderful, and a lot of folks enter into monogamous dynamics, first of all, without defining what monogamy means for them, so they have different expectations of what monogamy even means. But also, they enter it from a compulsory place, right? Because in Western culture, in a Western patriarchy, monogamy, the institution of marriage and monogamy were really created to protect material assets and have really
Yeah,
nothing to do with love. It wasn't
yeah,
until the 18th century that love and romance were sort of coupled with the idea of monogamy because, frankly, it was so untenable for most people. So, America got a really great marketing company involved, decided to spice it up a little bit and couple it with the idea of love and sex and all of that being this great package. So it's been an evolution of thought that doesn't work for everyone. And and we do have this idea of like ownership that comes with marriage and monogamy for a lot of people,
mhm,
but we don't own another person. We can't, and we do not
yeah,
have the rights to our partner's sexuality. So I think like that can be really hard for people to hear and make sense of, but it can also create a little bit more ease in introducing new ideas into their sex lives, whether that includes another person or toys or anything else.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think going back to the word patriarchy, where, it has kind of always been more okay for a man to experience other pleasure outside, but not okay for the female.
Right, that double standard is largely embedded in patriarchy because again, like patriarchy was created, it is not inherent. It was
Yeah.
created to protect material assets. And when we look at it that way, we understand why those double standards often exist in relationship and why there is
Mm,
often this experience of heightened jealousy and possessiveness and ownership over a female partner's sexuality. So a lot of men have been
Mhm.
conditioned to believe that their partner's sexuality is theirs, and vice versa, right? But it
yeah.
can create a lot of potential for like flummoxing, being flummoxed, best case scenario, but also it can be something that some men will navigate by implementing violence. So I don't, sort of go into this conversation lightly. Like you want
Yeah.
to feel safe with your partner and have these conversations before you ever embark on a journey of inviting new partners in. But if it's something that you and your partner are okay with, it can be a really incredible experience.
I think it's such a progressive perspective
Mm.
that I really appreciate because I do think that if you're communicating with your partner and you make ground rules of, okay, we're going to invite this person into our,
Mhm.
space, and here are the ground rules, here's what we're going to do. I could see how it really would connect you in such a different way and could be a really positive experience if you can emotionally handle that and see it for what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say for any couples who are thinking about embarking into this space, one of the things to really make sure that you have well developed are your capacities for emotional regulation. Because the emotions will be big, right? Whatever they
Oh, yeah.
might be. And
Yeah.
jealousy, fear, all of those things come up, and that's to be expected. So, how do you regulate your emotions and how do you co regulate together and come back and sort of reclaim a position of safety with each other? And when you've got
Yeah.
that down, then this sort of exploration can feel really enhancing. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, obviously, it could go sideways if you're not with the right partner and you don't love and respect each other and understand it. But I just love the progressive thinking of different ways to
Yeah.
connect with your partner.
For sure. Okay, I'm going down this might be a rabbit hole, Are we ready?
I'm
This is
ready.
legit. This is legit. I'm gearing everyone up. So at what point does sex for someone can it become a sex addiction? And what does that look like? That might be a whole episode by itself.
It's a big topic, and I'll say that there is a lot of disagreement among mental health professionals about whether or not sex addiction is even a valid concept. So I'll start
Really?
with that. Um, for the folks who believe that sex addiction is real, they would say that the defining feature is that the person has identified a problem, they've identified negative consequences of their sexual behavior or preoccupation, and they've tried to stop and they've not been able to stop, right? Sort of the reductionistic criterion. And for folks on the other side of the conversation, they would say, sure, does out of control sexual behavior exist? Yes. But it's not an addiction to sex per se. It's more a compulsivity that is really geared around regulating themselves and regulating what they're doing. And they may not have a monogamous predisposition as their relationship orientation, but they are trying to fit into a monogamous mold because society has told them to do that. So they would say there's really no such thing as too high of a desire, right? What someone does with that can become problematic, and so they would look at it sort of similarly and say, let's identify what are the negative consequences of your sexual behavior in your life, and are they actually the result of your relationship with sex, or do you have a relationship conflict where you and your partner have different libidos, or different interests? It's not really a sex addiction if you have different interests, right? It means
Mm,
different interests. So we would really look at not pathologizing someone's desire or frequency unless they've decided that there's something problematic. For example, maybe they are engaging in a behavior that breaks the law. Well, that's problematic for a lot of reasons. And it may
mhm,
not be
Yeah.
compulsive, but it's problematic. So we just sort of look at this: is it a legal conflict, a relationship conflict, a spiritual conflict? Like, where actually does the conflict lie? And is it actually with sex, or is it something else?
well, then where does is porn addiction a real thing?
The same argument would exist for both sides,
Okay.
right? And so, I definitely have seen a lot of compulsivity with porn, and I think that it's not really the porn. I think it's actually like the devices and the technology. And
Mm,
the porn becomes an amplifying variable because there's so much taboo around it. And so, where there's
yeah.
taboo, there's fear, and fear creates adrenaline in the body. So, a lot of folks are
Mm.
now organizing their relationship with pleasure to have a heightened experience of adrenaline and also this very compulsive medium, right? Their technology available to them at all times. So I would say we'd be well served to not look at porn as being the problem, because porn is an expression, it's an art form. How we create porn can be problematic, right, if it exploits other people. And how we
Mhm.
consume porn can be problematic if we do not create containment around it that makes sense for our lives and the lives we want to lead. Or if it is hurtful to us or the people around us in some way. So, is it problematic if you're watching porn a lot? Probably not. Is it problematic if you're watching porn a lot and you're not maintaining good boundaries around it, and now it's on your kid's iPad and your kids are exposed to it? Yes, that's problematic, right? If you
Mhm.
Yeah.
recognize that and you have good boundaries in place and you say, I'm never going to use that iPad again because my kids use that device. Okay, so it's not the porn use, it was the poor boundaries around it.
That's
Okay.
an
Now
interesting way to look at it, don't you think?
oh, okay. This is the massive rabbit hole of all rabbit holes. Are we ready?
Let's go.
This is gonna be this is for sure an entire conversation, but we're just gonna this just was next on my list, and it just happened to I was just pulling a bunch of things from, your Instagram that I found interesting and the podcast that you've done, but is there a relationship with sex, whether it's addiction or just maybe an unhealthy level, and narcissism?
That's a great question. I would say yes. There definitely is. With any kind of addiction or compulsivity, there's a level of egocentrism that exists there. And what that means, said another way, is compulsive behavior, whether it's with a substance or it's a process addiction, like with food, for example, or with porn. Um, the egocentrism is about protecting the self, right? So that person becomes really entrenched in keeping their sort of one person psychology intact. And the addiction is a way that they do that, it's a coping strategy. So there is some inherent self preservation and self focus that comes with any kind of compulsivity. But what is difficult to know is whether or not there is an underlying narcissism there, because we can't know that until someone gets containment around their compulsive behaviors for a period
Mm,
of time, right? When many people get into recovery, that self focus is not so pervasive. They're able to be more
mm.
attentive to the people in their lives and more reciprocal and more inclusive of other people in their lives. So we wouldn't say that there's an inherent narcissism there. But for some folks who have been in recovery for a long time, if they're still really myopically self focused, then we might look at whether or not they meet the criteria for more of a narcissistic personality organization.
I'm, like, fascinated by this
I know,
topic.
it's so fascinating.
Oh, that's a whole other podcast because, I mean, I really like this. I think it's so interesting when there's personality disorders in a relationship
Mhm.
and how you have to navigate around that. Because I know a lot of people are experiencing
Mhm.
one side of that
Yeah.
with a partner.
Yeah, and it is really hard, I would say, for the person who's on the other side of that, right? Because personality disorders are what we call egosyntonic. And what that means
Mhm.
is that they don't really cause distress to the person who has the disorder. They cause distress to the people around them, right? Which is
Yeah.
super hard versus other conditions like depression or PTSD are ego dystonic, meaning they actually cause distress to the person who has the disorder and they are motivated to feel better, right? Yeah.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
we're
That
doing a
is
whole other one
so
on
interesting.
personality
I know.
disorders.
I'm like, that is so interesting. Well, to switch gears, one of the other questions that was coming up is all of the dating apps. And if you are single, I have some friends who are newly single. And it seems that in my network, or from what I hear, people are now, it's just having sex on the first date. You meet someone, I mean, you've barely had a latte with them, and all of a sudden you're having sex with them. Do you, what do you think about having sex the first time you meet someone, and how that's affected the dating world or people's, views on it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think we often conflate sex with a relationship. So some people are sexual early because it's a way that they try to get connection and sort of secure a relationship. And I think if that's your strategy, you're probably going to be really disappointed because it can happen. You can have sex on the first date, and yes, a relationship can arise from that, and it can be a really healthy relationship. So I'm not pathologizing sex on the first date at all.
Mhm,
And there are so many people who are looking for sex just to be sexual, and that can be fine, right?
mhm,
So when there's a mismatch in what the intention is where there's a discrepancy. And I think that we are really conditioned differently around what sex means. So a lot of people, but I'll say it's probably more skewed toward women, are sexual because they want a relationship, and a lot of men are conditioned to talk about relationship because they want sex. So there's like
So true.
a different sort of like
Wow.
expectation.
So true.
Yeah. So if you're going to be sexual on the first date, that can be fine. I would say just don't hang a lot of hope on what the outcome is going to be. If you're trying to have a relationship and you find yourself in a pattern where you're having a lot of sex but no relationship, it might be advantageous to kind of slow down and get to know people a little bit more. It's not a guarantee that sex will then lead to relationship, even if you slow down, but you can
Mhm.
practice more discernment to really evaluate compatibility differently. And you're going to weed out the folks who are just trying to get laid fast, right? Because
Yeah.
they're not going to
Yeah.
tolerate going on lots of dates to get to know people. So it's a great way to sort of measure like what are someone's intentions, at least in the short term.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you're on Bumble, isn't it expected?
What?
I don't know these apps. I just heard that that's one that you're like, well, you're going on there with a purpose. Maybe it's more, I don't know.
I think people
Uh,
gamify the apps and they go on the apps for lots of different reasons, and they're often on more than one app. So I don't think going on
yeah.
one app is any kind of security against these experiences, because people are people, and they're
Yeah.
gonna be motivated to do what they're motivated to do regardless of the vehicle.
Okay. Laura, did you have something else on
Oh my
this?
gosh. No, no. Mm-mm.
Well, okay. This is like totally taking it off topic again for one last final,
Oh, no, we need
question.
to just get all the questions and we can just switch gears.
I, I,
So
I do have a hard
there is this,
time.
I have teenagers.
Mhm.
Laura has an infant. So we're like on opposite ends of the
Mhm.
spectrum right now as far as parenting. But with teens, I mean, I'm hearing things that I'm like, you guys are making this up. You're lying. But they're not. I mean, I think that there's all of this with the technology and with porn and with phones and, all of this stuff. Girls are going in and like doing things with boys without ever even having kissed them
Yeah.
because that's kind of like, I don't know. I don't know if it's like TikTok. I don't know where it's coming from, a lot of different places, but that it's just like this is what we do now.
It's coming from an absence of adequate sex ed for the majority of
Mm,
children in this
Mm,
country. So we don't eh, there's so much diversity across school districts in terms of what is taught for sex ed, and many
mhm.
states do not even have a requirement to teach medically accurate sex education. So
ugh,
that's a thing. Um, so what I would say is that there's an absence of appropriate sex education around consent, around pleasure, around helping adolescents understand like even just what is included under the umbrella of sex. So what's happening is a lot of kids are going to porn as a substitute sex educator, and they're
Oh,
seeing things like I'm hearing a lot of adolescents are engaging in strangulation during sex, and that can be,
what?
yeah, that
oh,
can be fun and pleasurable. And there are many people who love the physiological effects of that, or even the psychological effects of that. It can be okay for adults to do that. It is, however, one of the most dangerous activities to engage in, because restricting someone's airway can result in brain damage even without them losing consciousness. So it's really dangerous, and you have to practice it with a lot of safety mechanisms, but it is something that's depicted in a lot of porn. So I'm hearing a lot of adolescents are sort of going for these more extreme kinds of behaviors without the proper education and safeguarding. And so they are replicating what they're seeing because they're not actually being educated on other examples of how to be sexual, right? So I think we have to look at the zeitgeist of the increase in misogyny that is showing up all over our world right now, but definitely in the States in
Mhm.
the last 8 to 10 years. That's being reflected in the erotic media that is being created, and our young people are being exposed to that. And they're also being exposed to a lot of bros with podcasts who have no education about these topics but big opinions. And
Oh boy.
they're
Ugh.
listening to what these men have to say, and that is really shaping their their belief system about women and about sex in ways that are super implicit and unconscious. So it is sort of scary when there's not a lot of
Yeah,
other good complementary sex education out there for our young people.
that is
Laura,
scary.
did you have like I never had a conversation. My parents never had a sex education conversation with me. Did yours?
No.
No, nothing. So I guess the theme here is like abstinence of well, or just not abstinence, but absence of a conversation
Hmm.
is not doing your child any good.
Yeah.
So it's never comfortable to be like, okay, kids, let's sit down and, but
Mhm.
having that open, honest, this is gonna, conversation about education
Mhm.
is really the key because these things are not going away.
No, they're not.
They're not going the internet's not going away. All of this access to porn is not gonna go away.
Mhm.
So if we just dodge the conversation and be like, well, they're not really into girls or whatever, we have no idea really what's going on in their head.
Yep, no idea. And it's
Well,
better to be proactive. And it's not just one conversation to have with them, it's multiple small conversations, right? In bite sized morsels. But parents would be doing themselves and their kids a huge service if they follow accounts like Sex Positive Families on social media is a really good one, or I think it's called Consent Parenting is a really good one. But learn about porn literacy. There's an author who Peggy Orenstein has written really great books called Boys and Sex and Girls and Sex. Every parent, in my opinion, should read these books because it's so illustrative in terms of what kids are growing up with these days relevant to porn and sex and their exposure. So super helpful to like help educate yourself, be literate on what you're actually seeing in porn and how to dissect what is ethical porn, what isn't, so that you can guide your kids in a way that actually helps them make smart decisions for themselves. Because without that guidance, they are going to go along with whatever they're exposed to and or they're going to rebel against whatever is really restrictive and off limits.
I'm buying the books
Same.
and
I'm
listening
like,
to the podcast right now because I'm like, oh, my time's now, Laura. At least you have a good 13 years.
yeah. No, it's true. But that's such helpful information because I think, yeah, parents don't know where to start and how to have the conversation and that it should start so much younger than they probably expect with just that consent.
Yeah.
W- Oh my gosh. Or even just I wished that my parents would have talked to me even about how beautiful it is going to be when it is the right time in your life and it's you're going to love it and to be able to connect with another human and it's this beautiful thing, not taboo. I also wish that was a part of the conversation.
Totally,
Mhm.
right? Like we get so fear mongering with our young people, like don't get an STI, don't get pregnant, don't have sex, don't do the thing, that we do forget to teach them that it is about pleasure and it is about
Mhm.
mutuality. And one of the things I wish that more parents would really emphasize with their young people of all genders is the importance of reciprocity of pleasure, right? Because we have a
Mhm.
culture of implicit expectation that pleasure is for boys or people with penises. And a lot
Mhm.
of girls or people with vulvas are like just sort of capitulating to whatever that experience of pleasure is to these male partners. And the orgasm gap is huge, right? Like
Yeah.
women are not having orgasms with men. They are with women, but they're not having orgasms with men. And there's a reason for that, right? The way we talk about sex with girls and boys plays a big role in how much they expect to have pleasure with each
Mm.
other.
It is so true. And I'm glad you made that point. I know, I think it's really good when parents do say, you also should be having pleasure. You also should be experiencing orgasms. And it's not, you're just not there for the man. But I do feel like that is a real thing.
It is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, as par for the course, nothing was actually touched on the actual
Oh, I know.
questions
We have
on our
so many.
podcast.
I know. We have.
Every time I'm like, drats. Now we have to go back again because but this has been I'm sensitive to your time.
I know.
This
We
has
both.
been so amazing and just informative. I know we covered a vast variety of topics. the majority that weren't even on our list, but this was a beautiful and very educational conversation. So thank you so much for your time and for, enriching our audience with all of your knowledge
Expertise.
and expertise.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you both for asking such amazing questions. I mean, this was such a fun conversation, and I really do hope that it's helpful for people listening. Even if my progressive views don't align with what feels right for you and your family, I would say that's okay, right? Maybe if you take one thing away, it's to really have a focus on secular sex education, and then you can overlay your values and beliefs with that solid foundational knowledge and then figure out what makes the most sense for you.
I have
Yeah.
actually been blown away by your how like the conversation that you have and how you present it, that you are not just an expert and knowledgeable, but the way you present it and the context that you present it in, I feel like you cover everyone. Like anyone can have a
Yeah.
place with your therapy, and it's not so divisive of, this is good and this is bad. Like
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that about having you on and your particular style. Can people work with you one-on-one, or do they have to live in California? How does that work?
No, I'm actually licensed in 4 states. I'm in California, Florida, New York, and Illinois. And my team, I have a team right now of about 15 providers. And so we are in 9 states total, but we also have 2 sex coaches on our team who can work with people internationally. So, yes, people can work with
Wow.
me, they can work with my team. We all have this same sort of philosophy around meeting people where they are and really helping them create a relationship with sex that is meaningful to them. So it's not about my values or my team's values.
Mhm.
It's about your values and what makes sense for you.
I'm
That's what
hoping
I
that
love.
Colorado and Utah are on this. I'm in Colorado, Laura's
I
in
know.
Utah.
Yeah,
Are they on the list?
Colorado is on our list. Yep. Utah will be soon, but not yet.
Okay, good.
Mhm.
That's really good. I
Yeah.
just love that there's zero shame and it just feels so safe talking to
Mhm.
you. And I love that you're providing that for the world. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kate. We look forward to having you on again. And once again, thank you for your time and expertise.
Thank you both. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
if you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and sharing the Body Pod with your friends.
Until next time.